You have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You have made us for yourself, and restless are our souls until they find rest in you. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Is there any place I can go to avoid your spirit, to be out of your sight? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. So let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad. Let the sea resound and all that is in it. Let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Let all the trees of the forest sing for joy. And with joy we will draw water from the wells of salvation. Sing praises to the Lord, for he has done gloriously. Let this be known in all the earth. Shout aloud and sing for joy, O royal Zion, for great in your midst is the Holy One of Israel.
Good morning, Grumlaw. How you guys doing this morning? Yeah, good. Hey, my name is Jason Lowen. I got the privilege of being the strategy pastor here at Grumlaw. And today is Palm Sunday. And in some churches around the country, probably even around the world, you could walk into church and actually get a palm branch, like a branch from a tree. And if you're new to this whole church thing, you're like, what the heck? Why would churches give out branches from trees? Like, it's kind of destructive. Or if your kids are anything like mine, and everything that they get from church ends up on the floor of your vehicle on the way home, you're probably like, praise Jesus that they're not giving out branches at church today. And seriously, like, what's with these tree branches? You know, growing up going to church just about every single week. This is like my 34th Palm Sunday. I mean, I was there every single week, and sometimes multiple times a week. And Palm Sunday for us, you know, we would go into church. There's 6 of us in my family, and we would get palm branches in the main service. And then, you know, we were one of those families that stayed for like every single service. And so we get an extra palm branch at like the Sunday school class. And so there's half of a tree on the floor of our van, our minivan on the way home. And my brother and I realized very quickly that these palm branches, they make terrible guns, right? I mean, they're just like flimsy. There's no structure to them. And they don't make good swords either for the exact same reason. But what we did find out very early on is they make really good whips, right? So my brother and I were in the backseat of the minivan. There's a little space in between us. You can't really get a good wind-up, but like we would play, you know, the game that every, you know, set of boys would play, like who's the biggest sissy, right? Like, he takes a crack, and I take a crack, and then he take one, and I take one. And we try, and in a 20-minute ride home, like who's going to give up, right? Who's the biggest sissy? And you know, really, all that I really remember, you know, from the teaching side of Palm Sunday, because it wasn't just about the palm branches. All that I really remember, you know, in these last 34 years, is that there's this guy named Jesus who needed us for some reason to take our coats off and cut down palm branches and put them on the road so that he could ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. And I remember as a kid thinking, man, like, if I was there, I'd probably be like worried, is this donkey going to poop on my coat? Like, that's my only coat. Like, are you serious? Like, why is he doing that? So I thought this morning that it would be good if we spent a bit of time exploring what Palm Sunday is really all about. And maybe just maybe, it'll add some color to our experience, to our journey. And maybe for some of you, you're just beginning to explore this whole faith, this whole like religion, spirituality thing. And so whether you're a Jesus follower or not, whether you're confident in where you stand in this whole Sunday church, spirituality, religion thing or not, I'm excited because this morning we're going to spend a bit of time exploring the why behind it all. And that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to ask a whole bunch of why questions. And maybe for some of you, as I say that, you have flashbacks to what happened last night, right? As you tried to put your 3-year-old to bed, right? You're like, hey, it's time to go to bed. And Shay, I don't know if you experienced this with Logan at all, right? Hey, it's time to go to bed. Why? Because I'm the parent. Why? Because you're the kid. Why? Well, you're only 2 years old. Stop asking me questions. Why? Right? I mean, like seriously, it can be really, really annoying, And I'm hoping that this morning, as we ask a bunch of why questions about Palm Sunday and everything surrounding this, I'm hoping that it's not going to be annoying. I'm hoping that as we pursue these why questions, that it will be helpful. And I'm confident that as we explore the why behind Palm Sunday, it will make our lives better and make us better at life. And so this morning, we're going to spend a few minutes looking at the firsthand account of the events leading up to the death of Jesus. And the thing of it is, no one in the historical community has ever really, at least not anymore, argued about the existence of Jesus. I mean, that is something that is pretty, it's commonly accepted that Jesus existed. Right? I mean, they argue about his claims, they argue about his teachings, they argue about his identity, but no one really argues anymore about whether he existed or not. And so now it's up to us. It's up to us to determine what are we going to do about the things that Jesus said. How are we going to respond to the things that he did? And so we're going to take a look at what this guy named Matthew, what he said. This guy, Matthew, who spent almost every single day of Jesus' 3.5-year earthly ministry, spent almost every day with him, and he wrote down a whole bunch of what Jesus said and a whole bunch of what Jesus did. And so the first question that I want us to spend a bit of time asking this morning is, why Jesus? Like why should we even care about what Matthew said in the first place about Jesus? And I think the first thing is that because Matthew records and tells us that Jesus predicted that 3 days after he was going to die, that he was going to rise from the dead. And I don't know about you guys, but if someone, if one of my friends was able to predict his resurrection, I was going to listen to everything that they said. And that's exactly what Matthew did, right? I mean, he heard and wrote down for us that Jesus predicted his death and resurrection, pulled it off. And so that's a pretty darn good reason to listen to what Matthew has to say. And then on top of that, Matthew, his life was so changed by the resurrection of Jesus that he spent all of the rest of his life telling others about Jesus. He didn't just risk his life for this. He actually gave his life for the resurrection of Jesus. You see, after Jesus rose from the dead and Matthew started telling everybody about the resurrected Jesus, Matthew actually traveled down to Ethiopia telling everybody what was going on. And while he was on his way down there, and then after he got to Ethiopia, the people there, they hated the fact that Matthew was talking about this resurrected Jesus. And they kept telling him to shut up, stop talking about it, stop it, Matt. And Matthew, his life was so changed by it that he refused to stop talking. So he was stabbed to death for it. And I'm convinced that Matthew was smart enough. He was smart enough. I mean, that if he saw these guys coming with knives, he's smart enough that he would have said, okay, life in prison, but please don't stab me. Stop. If Matthew knew that what he was saying was not true, if Matthew knew that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, if Matthew knew that everything that they had been talking about was just made up, he would have given it up. I mean, I'm pretty sure you guys would be smart enough to do that, right? If you knew that something you were talking about was a lie and you saw the heat coming, wouldn't you have given it up? But at the same time, I think that those of us here in this room are smart enough too, that if we would have seen someone risen from the dead, that our lives would have been forever changed by it. And that's exactly what happened to Matthew. He knew what he saw and he was forever changed by it. So that's why Jesus. But what about Palm Sunday? Why Palm Sunday? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Let's take a look at Matthew chapter 21. And so if you have a physical Bible, I'd encourage you to open up and follow along. Or you could, get out your phone and you could open up the Bible, which is kind of crazy. Never thought we'd be saying that, right? You can click on the YouVersion app. It's a free app. I encourage you to download that. And easy way to find Matthew, right? It's the first book in the New Testament. So you scroll past all the books of the names you don't recognize, right? Hosea, Obadiah, Malachi, like all these names you don't recognize. As soon as you start getting the names you do recognize, those Old Testament, that's what we call those ones. Those are the history of Israel. And the New Testament is the stories of Jesus in the early church. So Matthew is the first book of the Gospels, the first book of the accounts of Jesus. And we're going to go to chapter 21, and we're going to read verses 1 through 11. It says, and Jesus, as Jesus and the disciples approached Jerusalem, they came to the town of Bethphage on the Mount of Olives. Jesus sent two of them on ahead. Go into the village over there, he said. As soon as you enter it, you will see a donkey tied there with its colt beside it. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone asks what you are doing, just say the Lord needs them, and he will immediately let you take them. This took place to fulfill the prophecy that said, tell the people of Jerusalem, look, your king is coming to you. He is humble, riding on a donkey's colt. The two disciples did as Jesus commanded. They brought the donkey and the colt to him, and threw their garments over the colt and sat on it. Most of the crowd spread their garments on the road ahead of him, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. Jesus was in the center of the procession, and the people all around him were shouting, praise God for the Son of David. Blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Praise God Most High. The entire city of Jerusalem was in an uproar as he entered. Who is this? They said, and the crowds replied, it is Jesus the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. All right, so in all honesty, as I mentioned earlier, I've been in 34 different Palm Sunday services, and I've probably read this passage, I don't know, maybe 40, 50 times in my life. As I said, I grew up going to church. I grew up around this stuff, and for me, I just kind of breezed past it. I just read over it. Oh yeah, it's like Jesus needs us to put our stuff on the road, and he's going to walk over it, and yeah, it's leading up to the events of Jesus' death. But as Shay asked me to prepare a message for this Sunday, and I began looking at this passage with eyes to question, what's going on? I tell you what, I got so many questions. I don't know if you guys, maybe you're hearing this passage for the very first time. Maybe you got some of the same questions that I had growing up. First of all, why did Jesus tell his guys to go and steal some random dude's donkey? Are you serious? And then why did these guys go and do it? Why did they go and steal the donkey? And then who in their right mind would give up their two donkeys? I mean, seriously, someone comes to your door. Yeah, I know you got a couple nice cars in your garage. The Lord needs them. Can I have the keys? Seriously? Who in their right mind would give up the keys to their car? Get out of here, get lost. What do you think you're doing, right? And then, okay, next question. How did the city already know? How did the city already know? Why was the crowd so excited? And then the last question, why did the city care that the crowd was so excited that this guy was riding in on a donkey? So, I mean, just tons of, and there's probably more. But I think that as we begin to explore, and we're going to start with this question, why the donkey? Why the donkey? And as we explore this question, I think that the answers to many of the other questions, these questions, and maybe some other ones that you might have, are going to begin to fall in line. So first, why the donkey? Jesus knew exactly why he was here. He knew his purpose. He knew his mission, which also means that Jesus knew that several hundred years earlier, that there was a prophecy that the Messiah, the King, the Savior, would come riding into the city of Jerusalem on a donkey. I mean, Jesus knew exactly who he was, and he knew that that was about him. Okay, but seriously, I mean, lots of people have ridden into the city of Jerusalem on a donkey. I mean, that was the primary mode of transportation, right? They would have hundreds of thousands. If you think about all the hundreds, how many people came riding in the city of Jerusalem? I mean, that'd be like me telling you guys, 150 people in this service, 150 people, so 300, maybe 400 people, we count our kids. Guys, Barry Sanders is going to become riding through the streets of Grand Blanc in a black Silverado. I don't know when, but he's coming. Like, I mean, seriously, like the 400 of us, maybe 500, we tell the people in the gym, and like we're all super excited. We all get on a message app together, and we're like, okay, so you take this shift, I'll take the next shift, and we're gonna cover Grand Blanc. Like we're gonna see, and we got our binoculars out, and like that might last a week, right? Maybe 2 weeks. 6 months later, right, there's going to be like two crazy guys with their beer hats in the lawn chair with their binoculars, like peering into the window of every black Silverado. Is that Barry? Is that Barry? No. Is anyone still even on the Messenger app? They all left. What the heck, right? I mean, at some point, the people in the city of Jerusalem would have stopped checking every single guy who was riding into the city on a donkey. Okay, so that's why it was so significant for Jesus to ride into the city on a donkey, right? I mean, it was a prophecy about it. But why would the people have gotten so worked up about this? And I think before we can really dive into this part of the story, we need to understand a bit of the backstory of specifically the Jewish people. And you don't have to turn there. I'm just going to make some reference to it. But all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, God made this promise to this guy named Abraham. God approached Abraham and said, Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. Your descendants are going to become a great nation. And that through your descendants, the entire world will be blessed. And this promise became, out of this, the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, began to develop an incredible sense of national pride. And rightfully so, because this is an incredible promise. Through this people, the entire world will be blessed. And so many years after Abraham, Isaac was born. And then several years after that, Jacob was born. And then 11 generations later, David was born. And David was one of the most famous kings in all of Israel, King David. And then 28 generations later, from the exact same family line, Jesus was born. Jesus was born. And here's the crazy thing. Like across these 42 generations, these prophets and leaders would rise to the surface, and they would drop these hints, this like breadcrumb trail all along the way. And they would be talking about and making reference to this promise, making reference to the fact that God was going to keep his promise, that God was going to send someone, a savior, a king, a Messiah, who would ultimately save and rescue the nation, but ultimately the world. The fulfillment of this incredible promise that the nation of Israel had found so much of their identity in. These prophets and these leaders, they would almost always rise to the surface and begin their political careers around the time when the nation of Israel was in exile. And here's what I mean by this. So when God formed the nation of Israel, he gave them a set of rules, guidelines, expectations, kind of like our Constitution, right? Here's how, as a nation, you should interact with each other, and here's how you should also interact with other nations. But years and years and years would go by when the nation of Israel would just continually disobey, ignore, turn away from God, and reject these lists, these guidelines, these expectations. And so God, what he would do is that he would send a foreign nation, sometimes the Babylonians, sometimes the Assyrians, sometimes the Persians, and he would send these foreign nations in to enslave the people of Israel for the purpose of bringing the nation of Israel to a place of desperation, to a place where they cried out because they so desperately wanted God to save them. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking like, that's kind of like us as parents in the way sometimes we need to deal with our kids. Now, my oldest, Landon, he's only 9, so I haven't really had to do this a whole lot with him. But I remember being a teenager, and maybe as I'm talking about this, some of you guys remember moments in your life as a teenager where, like, as a parent, I remember my parents having the same conversation with me over and over. I mean, over the course of years, the exact same conversation over and over and over and over again. And I know that as a parent, and kids, listen to this. Hear this. Kids, your parents, they want what's best for you. We want what's best for you. Like, as a parent, we're not trying to like be this like cosmic killjoy. We desperately want what's best for you. But I remember my dad telling me, adult decisions have adult consequences, right? And so, my siblings and I, we've all gone through this. I'm sure all of us have gone through this. Seasons where your parents have had the same conversation with you over and over and over again, and it comes to a point where they just have to just let you experience the full effect, the consequences of your decision. I mean, for example, my parents always had like a curfew for us. While we were living under their roof, we had a curfew, and there were seasons, where we would just continually like stay out way later than our curfew for all kinds of not so great reasons. And I remember there came a point where my parents stopped badgering us about the curfew. But then at the same time, like when we slept in and like missed the big midterm, or we didn't get to work on time because we were out way too late, and we either bombed our test or got fired from our job, like my parents refused to come and bail us out because adult decisions have adult consequences. And I think, I know that this is what God was doing with the nation of Israel. I mean, after years and years and years, sometimes like 100 years, hundreds of years or more, of the nation of Israel ignoring the instructions, that God would send a foreign nation to dish out these consequences, to enslave the nation for the purpose of bringing the nation of Israel to a place where they so desperately wanted God, where they were crying out and saying, God, save us, free us, redeem us, bring us back to this place of the promise, back from Genesis chapter 12. Like, we want that. And so these prophets, these leaders, they would rise to the surface. During these times when these people were in exile, and then they would often write. They would write about what was happening to the nation of Israel. And that was what most of their writings were about. If they were being enslaved by the Babylonians, these prophets and leaders would write about what God was doing, remind them of God's faithfulness in the midst of the Babylonian oppression. But sometimes the things that these prophets and these leaders wrote were about something more. Sometimes what they wrote about were about something more. And more often than not, the people of Israel knew what they were talking about. So over time, the nation of Israel, they began to have this incredible sense of confidence. They had this incredible sense of confidence that God was going to send someone to save them, to redeem them. That God had been promising this Messiah who was going to come and free them from slavery. And they were always being reminded of this promise back in Genesis chapter 12. Okay, so that's a bit of the backstory. That's a bit of the backstory that brings us to this story. Because the Israelites, they're in one of these seasons of oppression. Okay, they're being enslaved in the Roman Empire. And the Israelites, they hated the Romans. They so desperately wanted to be out of the captivity, the oppression of their current situation. They so desperately wanted God to send someone to save them. Now, they had learned to live in the Roman Empire, but they so desperately wanted out. And so the prophecies from the last 1,000 years or so had become so incredibly relevant to the nation of Israel. I mean, these are the things that great grandpa, he told us about the prophet Jeremiah. He told us the stories of Isaiah and then grandpa would relay those stories. And then you remember, dad would tell us at the dinner table and around the campfires about these prophecies, about the things that were coming. And then these would be the same stories, the same prophecies that in Hebrew school, all the boys and girls would be talking about these prophecies with each other because they were so confident, they were so hopeful that God was going to fulfill this promise, that God was going to fulfill these prophecies. Okay, so what are these prophecies? And there's 300 of them, and I got a list of, we're just going to go through 6 of them. We're not going to go through all 300 of them. We'd be here till Easter if we went through all 300 of them. Okay, so the first one, the first prophecy, Jesus, the Messiah, was going to be born in Bethlehem, Micah 5:2. And the next one, that he was going to leave Egypt, Hosea 11:1. And the third one was that he was going to be raised in Nazareth, from Isaiah 11:1 and 53:3. So just camp on here for a second in case you're new to this whole church thing. So Jesus, the reason why he was born in Bethlehem was because Mary, his mother, was from Bethlehem. Like that was from where her family lineage is. I mean, that was the hometown of King David, right? So she had to return to Bethlehem in order for a census. The king had ordered a census. So she was required to go there. And while she was there, that's when Jesus was born, hence Christmas. That's what we celebrate at Christmas, right? So then why would the Messiah leave Egypt? So this King Herod was nervous that a toddler was going to walk up to his throne and kick him off the throne. I mean, Herod must have been nuts. Like, are you serious? A toddler's going to kick you off your throne? Like, what's wrong with you, dude? So Herod was so nervous that a toddler was going to threaten his kingship that he ordered that everyone, 2 years old, every male boy, 2 years old and younger, would be killed in Bethlehem and the surrounding area. So Mary and Joseph, they were warned, his parents were warned about this coming danger. And so they were told, flee to Egypt. And so for the next several years, while there was a threat on Jesus' life, they lived in Egypt. And then when they were told that King Herod had died, they were told it was safe to return. Now, Mary and Joseph were not from, their extended family did not, they're not from Bethlehem, like their lineage is, but they didn't grow up there, and they're raising like Jesus. And at this point, I don't know when Jesus' siblings were born, but he did have multiple siblings. And so they wanted to return to where their extended family was, which is in Nazareth. So that's how Jesus was born in Bethlehem, left Egypt, and raised in Nazareth. So then fast forward a couple more years, the next prophecy was that he would perform all kinds of incredible acts of healing, 35, 5 through 6. And I encourage you to read the stories in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John about the incredible stories of healing that Jesus performed. The next one, it says healing in the corner of his garments from Malachi 4:2. And I'd encourage you at some point, read Malachi 4:2, but I'll tell you what it says. It says, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in his wings, and which obviously doesn't look exactly like healing in the corner of his garments. Well, when I was in Bible school, I sat under a Hebrew scholar. I do not know Hebrew, not a lick of it. That's the original language that the Old Testament was written in. And what this Hebrew scholar told me, my Bible teacher told me, was that when they translated it from Hebrew into English, they wanted it to sound poetic. Well, the problem was this is a prophecy about the Messiah. The Son of Righteousness is just another way of talking about the Messiah. And the literal translation, word for word translation, was that the Son of Righteousness, the Messiah, would rise with healing in the corners of his garments. And then if you look at Luke chapter 8, verse 43, and Matthew 14:36, there's several times, at least in those two passages, there's probably more, where the crowds would press around Jesus, and they were beginning to understand that Jesus, we think he's the one. We think he might be the promised Messiah. And like I got this like bleeding issue, or I got these other like diseases or other things going on, and I'm sick, or I need healing, and I don't want to like interrupt him, but I know if he is the one, and all I have to do is just touch the corner of his garments, and I'll be healed. And that's exactly what happened. And then the last one from Zechariah 9:9, Jesus, the Messiah, would come riding into the city on a donkey. All right, so up until this point, in Matthew 21, right, where Jesus tells them to go and get the donkey, up until this point, right before Jesus tells these two guys to go and steal some random dude's donkey, they're pretty certain, not only his followers, but also the crowds, they're pretty certain that Jesus is the one. They're pretty certain that he is the Messiah. And then on top of that, you have this whole like Roman oppression thing. Right? You have this whole like situation that the Jewish people are in. And pretty much, I mean, it's been like God's pattern that when they cry out and ask as a nation, and they cry out in desperation and ask for someone to save them, that God almost always answers, rises up a prophet or a leader, which they're pretty sure is Jesus, and he almost always takes back the nation by military force. And so that's what the crowds are expecting Jesus to do. And so while Jesus' followers, they've been paying attention to Jesus. And while Jesus' followers, they're beginning to understand that what Jesus is all about is something far bigger, far better than just Roman oppression. And yet I'm sure in their mind, they're like, okay, Jesus, yeah, like freedom from something bigger than Roman, but you're going to deal with the Romans too, right? Like they just want to make sure, like he's going to deal with the Romans too. I mean, they've seen him perform all these acts of healing. They talked to his mom. They knew about where he was born and fled to and came back from. I mean, they've seen all this stuff, right? And then they see people like touch the edge of his garments and get healing. I mean, freedom is coming. Freedom from Roman oppression and maybe, and probably something more. We're not quite sure about that. So this is where they're at. And then Jesus asks them to go and get the donkey. To go and get the donkey. And now they know for sure. Not only do they know for sure that Jesus is the one, that he's the Messiah, but now they're confident that it's coming, like right now. Everything that they have been waiting for as an entire nation for all of these hundreds of years, it's happening right now. It's starting. Everything they've been waiting for their entire lives. All the stories that they had heard growing up, everything that happened to their ancestors was going to happen again. And they were going to get to see it. And guess what? Their friend was going to lead the charge. And so when Jesus asked them to go to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives and get the donkey, these two guys and the rest of his followers began to tell everyone. And the word began to spread. I mean, if you guys were in their shoes, wouldn't you have told absolutely well, okay, I'm sure we would have been smart enough not to tell like the Roman soldiers, right? Because we were like hoping that we're going to get rid of them. But everyone else. And the thing of it is there was tons of extra people in the city of Jerusalem at this time. So scholars estimate that in the days of Jesus, that Jerusalem was home to about 100,000 people. But during this week, this marks the beginning of Passover week. During Passover week, there would be nearly 3 million people that would flood the streets of Jerusalem. And the reason why Passover week was so significant to the Jewish people was because this was the week that they remembered that many hundreds, even thousands of years earlier, God had freed them from Egyptian slavery. And I'm sure that they would also be thanking God for freeing them from Babylonian slavery and Assyrian and Persian and all the other times that as a nation they had screwed up, like they were thanking God for freeing them from them. And as a people, 3 million people, praying that one day God would free them from Roman oppression. So you have this huge surge of people coming into Jerusalem at the same time that Jesus' closest followers were telling everyone that they could see, everyone that they could find, that Jesus was going to be riding into the city on a donkey. And he was the guy. He was the one that they had been waiting for all of these years. The one was coming. Freedom was coming. Redemption was coming. And he is coming today. He is coming. And so I think that this is why the kids in the crowds were taking their coats off and laying them down. Why they were cutting the branches off of the palm trees and covering the road with the palm trees. Why they were singing. Why they were worshiping. Because he is worthy. And even though the crowds, they didn't really fully understand, maybe even didn't understand at all why Jesus was coming, what he was all about. I mean, Jesus was there to save them from something far worse than Roman oppression. From Roman slavery. Jesus was there to free them and ultimately to free us from the slavery of sin and death. I mean, the slavery of sin, it's like a cancer that infects all of us. And there's no cure for it. I mean, we literally can't do anything. No amount of good deeds can remove this infection from us. Like, we are a broken people. But God wanted to fix us. He wanted to save us. He wanted to redeem us. But he knew that it would cost him everything. So all along, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, when God promised Abraham to bless the entire world through his family line, God was talking about Jesus the whole time. This is what God had in mind. Every time that a prophet or a leader would rise to the surface and drop these little hints about the coming Messiah, it was all about Jesus. This was God's plan all along, to send Jesus to bring our salvation, to bring our freedom, to bring our redemption. And this is what worship is really all about. And here at Grumlaw, we don't often talk a lot about worship. We often use the word singing. Because we know that there's several of you that are here each and every week that maybe just aren't ready to worship. But singing, yeah, I could do singing. And maybe even like a time of reflection, like thinking about what was said. Maybe you're wondering about this journey, this spirituality, and you just need that time of reflection. But for some of us, it's worship. It's proclaiming the greatness of God and all that he's done in our lives. And we can worship in song, yeah. but we can also worship in the way we live our lives. But that's a whole nother sermon for a whole nother day. We're not going to go there. But we want to create space here at Grumlaw for everyone. So for you, whether it's a time of singing, time of reflection, or a time to worship, a time to proclaim the greatness and the awesomeness of God. So why do you worship? I know for me, there's been times in my life where I've expected, I've thought, I've prayed for God to do one thing, and then weeks, months, sometimes years later, I've realized God was up to something far, far better. Most recently, this happened in our family. We were getting ready to move from Denver back here to Flint, Michigan. And we were praying for nearly a year that God would open the doors for me to be able to work remotely, and it looked like that was going to happen. My supervisor was like all on board with that. And then literally like weeks before we are ready to move, the rug gets pulled out from under us. I get a new supervisor, and he tells me, yeah, if you want to keep this job, you have to stay here in Denver. Well, the problem was the ball's already so far down the field, it feels like everything's going to collapse, and yet we knew that God is someone we could trust. And we knew that he was calling us to move from Denver back to Michigan. And I tell you what, 10 months later, seeing all that God has done, seeing God show up and show off has been incredible. And we as a family, it has caused us to worship him in far greater ways than if our original plan had actually come through, because God's way is always better. So why do I worship? I worship because I know that he wants what's best for me. Why do I worship? Because I know that he is good and that he always pursues the greatest possible good. I worship because I know that I can trust him regardless of my circumstances. I worship because he saved me, he redeemed me, he freed me. I worship because I know that without Jesus, I would get exactly what I deserve. All the things that I've done wrong have earned me eternal separation from God in hell. And he saved me from that. I worship because I know that he sees the bigger picture. I worship him because I know that he loves me and because I know that he has a plan for me. I worship him because he is worthy. He's 100% worthy of my worship. He's 100% worthy of my life and devotion. He's 100% worthy of my trust. Why do you worship? Why do you worship?